Welcome back. Becoming an issue in the governor's race this week, Republican candidate Tim Michels calling on Governor Tony Evers to halt all paroles. Now, whether that's something he can or can't do, joining me to discuss all that is University of Wisconsin Law School Professor Cecilia Klingele. Good morning.
Good morning.
So right off the bat, can the governor stop paroles in the state of Wisconsin?
Not directly, no. The parole board has the authority to make decisions about who is paroled, and even they have limited authority in some cases. The law itself dictates who has to be released when. What the governor can do is control who is on the parole board, and the chair in particular is an appointed position that is within the governor's control.
Where does the state of Wisconsin law on parole put us? I mean, would it even be legal in some senses for some prisoners to not have an option of parole?
So it is already the case that most prisoners in the Wisconsin prison system are not parole eligible. Wisconsin abolished parole as of December 31st, 1999. So actually there aren't very many prisoners left in our system who are eligible for parole release. It gets confusing though, because we have to understand what that term means under our law. So typically we think of parole as a period of supervision that follows a person's time in prison. All Wisconsin prisoners are and have for some time been subject to that kind of supervision. The difference is that beginning at the end of 1999, we changed it from a system where people could be released, and in some cases were required to be released, before the full completion of their court-ordered sentence, sometimes at the discretion of a parole board, to a system in which there is no parole board making decisions about who gets out when. Instead, the law very clearly defines when it is that a person moves from prison to community supervision. We now call that supervision not parole, but extended supervision. That's the term we use. There are, however, still a small number of individuals, or at least small as a percentage of the overall population, of people in our Wisconsin prison system who were sentenced before December 31st, 1999. And those individuals, at least the majority of them, are eligible for parole. For a portion of their sentence, they could be released when the parole board thinks that an appropriate amount of time has been served, and releasing them won't imperil community safety or diminish the seriousness of their offense. And for all of them, there comes a point in their sentence, usually about 2/3 of the way through, where the law requires that they be released so that they have a portion of their sentence that's served in the community, supervising that transition from the institution back into our neighborhoods.
So in terms of what a governor can control, as you mentioned, he can control who leads the parole board. What types of differences might happen if you have, in terms of who leads that board, right? So in terms of that discretion that there is in some paroles, how might parole decisions change if there's someone perhaps stricter on crime versus perhaps seen as more lenient leading the parole board?
Well, our hope, of course, is that regardless of people's ideologies, they are making decisions about release based on statutory factors and considerations of safety and justice. That's certainly the hope. And that said, people are going to make discretionary decisions based on their understanding of how to weigh competing values and considerations. And so certainly their underlying principles and experiences are going to affect how they interpret the laws that they're charged with applying. I think all those personal kinds of decisions, though, occur against a much bigger backdrop that's important to notice. Not just for Wisconsin, but for the whole United States, which is that as our country, in most, not all, but most states, moved away from strong reliance on parole as a release mechanism for people who are in prison, and this happened starting in the late 1970s, going all the way through the 1990s, what we saw was that even in states that retained parole for at least some prisoners, parole rates dropped. Right? As we abolished or restricted parole for newly sentenced people who had been sentenced under a different system where the expectation of parole was much higher, were influenced, their release decision was influenced by the culture of the times and of the day. And so we see that regardless of people's political backgrounds, as a general rule, modern parole boards are much more restrictive in making release decisions than were parole boards of many years past.
One thing I want to touch on, perhaps there's some confusion here just in the general public knowledge between parole and pardon. Now, Governor Evers has done the most pardons in the state of Wisconsin, which is a very different thing from parole. If you could just get into that just a little bit before we wrap up.
Sure, all of these different terms that apply to people who've been convicted of crimes and are now entering the community or living in the community. So when we talk about a pardon, they can take lots of different forms, but the one that we are most accustomed to seeing in Wisconsin involves basically an act of official forgiveness for people who have committed crimes, usually long ago in the past, and have typically lived law-abiding lives, reintegrated themselves into the community, and who are being held back in some way from their full participation in civic life by a long past conviction, sometimes, in fact, often of a fairly minor nature, though pardons certainly can be used in any kind of a criminal case. So in those cases, pardons are sort of acknowledging officially that we want people fully restored in our community's life, and they have a legal effect that erases a lot of barriers and civil law restrictions that may apply to people who have been convicted of crimes in the past. Parole is an entirely different situation where what we're really talking about is releasing someone from a prison back into a community setting, which will occur at some point anyway, but then having a period of time in the community in which they're subject to monitoring and to restrictions, and also being given access to services and other, hopefully, supportive opportunities to reintegrate successfully.
Some important context there. I appreciate that. Is there anything else we haven't touched on that you think would be important to raise?
Not in the short amount of time we have.
We could have a much longer discussion. I'm aware of that. Professor, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
All right, we will be right back.